They say when danger is coming, the world gets quiet first. But that morning in Toronto, the silence felt wrong. Almost like the city was holding its breath. My name is Elena Carter. I'm 32, a graphic designer, and the kind of woman who thought she'd seen everything life could throw at her. Until the day my neighbor knocked on my door at 5 a.m. and changed everything. Before I tell you what happened, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? And if you love stories that start calm, then spiral into something darker, hit that subscribe button right now because this one still gives me chills. It started like this. A cold morning, quiet streets, and a knock on my apartment door that sliced through the silence like a blade. 3 times. Urgent. When I opened it, Marcus, my next-door neighbor, stood there, eyes wide, face pale, breath trembling like he'd seen a ghost. He said just one thing. Don't go to work today. Please, Elena. Just trust me. I remember freezing in my doorway, my heart tripping over itself. He was serious. Too serious. I asked why, but he just shook his head and whispered, "You'll understand by noon." Then he turned and ran down the hallway like the building was on fire. Didn't make sense. Marcus wasn't the type to scare easily. He worked night shifts at the hospital, saw blood, death, tragedy every day, but that look in his eyes, it wasn't fear. It was guilt. For the next few hours, I couldn't shake it off. I kept replaying his voice, those words, that trembling hand. By 7 a.m., I was dressed for work but couldn't bring myself to grab my car keys. Something deep inside me said wait. And for once in my life, I listened. At 11:30, my phone rang. Unknown number. A calm woman's voice said, "Is this Elena Carter? I'm calling from the Toronto Police Department." My heart sank. "There's been an explosion at your office building," she continued. "We're still investigating, but it doesn't look accidental." Everything around me went numb. I could hear my pulse in my ears. If I had left for work like every other morning, I wouldn't be here telling this story. But Marcus, my neighbor who saved my life, vanished that same morning. His apartment was empty by sunset. No bags, no phone, no trace. That's when I realized. Some people warn you because they care, and others warn you because they owe you a truth they can't say out loud. And what that truth turned out to be. It was darker than anything I'd ever imagined. Tell me something. Would you trust someone if they showed up at your door before dawn and told you to stay home? Or would you risk it anyway? After the explosion, the city went silent in a different way. The kind of silence that comes after screams fade, when people are still breathing but nothing feels alive. 4 days, Toronto was covered in police tape and questions. I spent most of that time on my couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment. Marcus's pale face. The way his voice cracked when he said, "Trust me," didn't feel random. Felt personal. The police called again 2 days later. They said they were still investigating. That word still haunted me. I had colleagues who never came home. People I'd eaten lunch with, laughed with, complained about deadlines with. Just like that. And Marcus, the man who saved my life, the only person who could explain any of this, had vanished into thin air. At first, I tried to convince myself he'd gone somewhere safe. But then I found something. Something he left behind. It was under my door, a week after the explosion. A plain envelope, no name, no address. Just a faint trace of his cologne and a folded note inside. 2 lines. No greeting. No explanation. "Elena, you were never supposed to be in that building. I tried to fix it. But it's bigger than you think." That was it. And suddenly it wasn't just fear anymore, it was obsession. I started digging. Through old emails, work messages, security logs. And that's when I found it. An unsigned document buried in my work archive. It was labeled, "Internal Audit, Restricted." Inside was a list of payments, all under my name. Transfers I didn't authorize. Amounts I could never afford. And one more thing. The account they were being funneled to belonged to Marcus A. Wells. My hands shook. Marcus wasn't just my neighbor. He was my coworker. A systems engineer who'd been assigned to our financial security team 6 months before the explosion. He wasn't supposed to live next door. He wasn't supposed to warn me. He was supposed to silence me. And suddenly, the accident didn't feel like an accident at all. Felt like a cleanup job gone wrong. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I'd see fire, smoke, screams, and Marcus's face. Not pale with guilt this time, but cold, unreadable. Then came the worst part, when I learned the company had filed an insurance claim 3 days before the explosion. Millions. Under a clause no one was supposed to know existed. The betrayal wasn't just corporate. It was personal. And in a city like Toronto, where secrets are buried under concrete and glass, I knew this wasn't going to end with the police. It was going to end with me. But before I tell you how I found Marcus again, how I learned what he did and why, I want you to pause for a moment. If someone saved your life, but also destroyed everything you ever trusted, what would you do? Would you forgive them? Or make them pay? And don't forget, hit that subscribe button if you're still with me, because the deeper I went into Marcus's secret, the closer I came to discovering something that would change everything. You ever stare at something so long that the lines start to blur? That's what the numbers on that audit file did to me. The more I read, the less they looked like numbers, and the more they looked like betrayal. Marcus's name. My company's name. My own digital signature stamped across transactions I never made. I'd been set up. Used like a pawn in a game I didn't even know existed. And the man who saved my life was the same man who'd helped destroy it. For days, I walked through Toronto like a ghost. The city lights blurred into streaks of silver and blue, and every time I passed a glass building, I caught my reflection, hollow-eyed, trembling, half a woman and half a storm waiting to break loose. I started tracing the payments backward, and that's when I discovered it. A shell company in Vancouver, owned by an offshore trust. The director's name, Daniel R. Carter. My father. I couldn't breathe. It felt like the world folded in on itself. Marcus hadn't betrayed me alone. He'd done it with my own family. I confronted my mother first. She hesitated, her voice trembling. Elena, your father did what he had to do. The company was going under. He said you'd never find out. Never find out. That phrase hit harder than any explosion ever could. They had used my job, my trust, to clean their mess. And Marcus, he was the middleman. The one who'd been hired to erase the evidence. He wasn't supposed to care. He wasn't supposed to warn me. But he did. That's why he disappeared. Because when he saw what was really planned, he realized the blast wasn't meant for the building. It was meant for me. My father had ordered my silence. Permanently. He thought destroying the office would erase every trace of his fraud. He didn't expect Marcus to grow a conscience. And he definitely didn't expect me to survive. The betrayal ran deeper than I imagined. Not just a father's greed, but a betrayal wrapped in family dinners, birthdays, and fake smiles. Every "I'm proud of you" suddenly felt like a line rehearsed for guilt. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make them feel even a fraction of what I felt. But revenge isn't about noise. It's about patience. So I played along. I smiled when my father called. I answered my mother's texts. And when they asked how I was coping, I said the same thing every time. I'm healing. But what I was really doing was planning. Because betrayal this deep doesn't fade. Ferments. Grows teeth. And when it's ready, it bites back. Tell me, if someone you trusted with your life turned out to be part of your destruction, would you confront them? Or destroy them silently from behind the scenes? And don't forget, hit subscribe now, because what I did next, it wasn't forgiveness. It was justice dressed as calm. When everything that once anchored you drifts away, the first feeling is not anger. It is emptiness. A cold, hollow space where your history used to sit. The week after I found out my father's name sat behind the dirty money, the world narrowed to 3 things. Calls that wouldn't stop, looks that did, and the slow, certain unraveling of a life I'd trusted as my foundation. Work closed its doors to me. Not with a dramatic firing. with polite emails and meaningless HR templates that said, "Under the circumstances, we're navigating this carefully." Co-workers who had laughed with me in the lunchroom now pretended not to see me in the stairwell. Friends texted check-ins that read like obituaries. Short, formal, and full of distance. The company pushed a narrative into the news feeds. A tragic accident, necessary litigation, an unfortunate series of events. Somewhere between corporate statements and legal silence, I was the awkward footnote. The house I'd half expected to move into one day felt foreign when I visited my parents after the confrontation. It smelled like meetings and paper, not home-cooked food. My father met my eyes with a calm that was practiced and smooth, the calm of someone who had decided he'd rather rewrite history than remember it. My mother looked away when I spoke. Guilt sat on her like a shawl she couldn't pull off. Then the messages began. Small court notices slipped under the door. A request to attend a preliminary inquiry. A demand for me to hand over devices, passwords, anything that could prove my innocence or complicate theirs. The police, who had once been helpful, now asked questions with the cool distance of professionals trained to assume everyone is suspect until proven otherwise. I realized with a sick, sinking clarity that surviving the explosion had not only spared my life but turned me into a liability, one they were quietly teaching everyone to ignore. Night after night, sleep became a thin, unwelcome guest. I'd wake at 3 with the memory of heat and sirens and Marcus's hand at my door. I thought about leaving the city, taking a new name, dissolving into a life where no one knew my face. In the small hours, despair sat with me. It visited like an old friend I didn't recognize. But rock bottom is a strange teacher. It strips the world down to what's left when pretense is gone. It leaves you with raw materials. Memory, will, and a decision. The first decision I made was practical. I stopped pretending I could do this alone. Pride had once kept me folding my wounds in on themselves. Pride had been useful to my father's narrative. Now pride was a shackle. I reached out, quietly, carefully, to people who wouldn't judge me for the noise in my life. An old university professor who knew how corporate audits worked. A lawyer who didn't blink at fraud, but asked smart questions. An investigative journalist who'd spent years chasing stories that made powerful men uncomfortable. I learned that asking for help is not defeat. It was a map. Each person I told gave me a piece of direction. Where to look, what records were public, which filings couldn't be hidden forever. The professor showed me the language auditors used when they were being forced to look away. The lawyer explained the difference between smoke and fire in legal terms. The journalist taught me how to document without becoming a legal target. Preserve copies, timestamp notes, make witness lists. Emotionally, I learned to hold two things at once. The small, human grief of betrayal and the cold, analytical curiosity of someone who needed to know exactly how the machine had been wired. I journaled everything. I kept receipts, screenshots, voicemail timestamps. I stopped ruminating and began recording. Each small, methodical act was a stitch that slowly closed the wound enough for me to move. There were dark nights where anger rose like tidewater, threatening to pull me under. I imagined spectacular payback, public shaming, viral exposes that would leave them gasping. But anger is loud and messy. My plan, such as it was, had to be the opposite. Precise, legal, and irreversible. If they had weaponized money and power, I would weaponize truth and patience. So I built a skeleton of resilience. A modest savings buffer, legal counsel, and a clean, private record of every irregularity I could find. I took temp design contracts, cut back on everything unnecessary, and learned to sleep again in fits and starts. I allowed myself small mercies, a good cup of coffee, a phone call from someone who believed me, an hour at a park where the city felt like a place that could be survived. Rock bottom clarified one thing more than any other. They had expected me to break and crawl back. They had not accounted for what happens when someone who has been used. As a foundation decides to become the architect. When you are pushed out of your own story, you don't always scream. Sometimes you redraw the blueprint. Before I move on, and trust me, what I did next required patience, restraint, and a readiness to wait for the right moment. Tell me this. When everything you trusted is turned against you, do you burn it down in fury or rebuild it, brick by careful brick? Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and leave your answer below. Because what came after the bottom was not noise. It was planning, and planning, when done right, looks deceptively like calm. They say grief changes your shape. But in my case, it sharpened me. Every sleepless night, every unanswered call, every echo of betrayal, it all became fuel. By the time December rolled around, I wasn't the same Elena Carter who had stood trembling in that doorway at 5 a.m. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was quieter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Because somewhere between losing everything and learning how to breathe again, I discovered something powerful. If they could build lies in silence, then I could build truth in the same way. Started small. One encrypted drive, then another. I used my design skills to create a web of mock datasheets that looked ordinary but were actually coded with records of every payment, every hidden transaction, every offshore transfer linked to my father's companies. Marcus had left me the key without realizing it. A single string of code embedded in that note he'd slipped under my door. At the time I thought it was just guilt. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a note. It was an instruction. Fix it. He'd written in the margin, almost invisible. And in the digital world he came from, fix it wasn't apology language. It was access language. When I decrypted it, the files opened like a floodgate. And what I saw wasn't just financial crime. It was manipulation, political bribes, shell donations under charity names. And at the center of it all, the signature of my father's firm, intertwined with the same contracts Marcus had helped design. That was the moment it clicked. Marcus hadn't just been an accomplice. He'd been a whistleblower. He'd realized too late that he was being used. And his warning was his way of trying to balance the scales before disappearing. But I wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't built for hiding. If Marcus wanted redemption through silence, I wanted it through exposure. So I started to prepare. Quietly. Systematically. I backed up every document onto cloud servers in 3 different countries. I mailed one encrypted copy to a journalist I trusted, the same one who'd once told me, if the truth scares people, you're getting close to something real. And then I began the harder work. Creating a pattern. See, revenge isn't about rage. It's about rhythm. The rhythm of patience. Knowing exactly when to make the first move. I stopped reacting emotionally and started playing strategically. My father's company was rebuilding its image. Charity events, glossy interviews, a family values rebrand that made me nauseous. He thought the scandal had died down. He thought I'd been erased, silenced by guilt and public shame. But I was right there in the background, under a new name, working as a freelance designer for one of their partner agencies. Every file that passed through my hands, every press release draft I edited, every logo I touched, I hid truth inside it. Tiny breadcrumbs, invisible to most, but traceable to those who knew where to look. And while the world saw my father on the cover of business magazines, smiling in his tailored suits, I saw something else. A man completely unaware that the rope he'd tied around my neck was slowly tightening around his own. Because in every system he'd built to hide his crimes, I was building one to reveal them. Carefully, patiently, beautifully. And that's when I realized something deep in my bones. The best revenge isn't always fire. Sometimes it's silence that burns. Before we move forward, tell me something. Would you rather strike once and loud, or wait until they forget you existed, then destroy them quietly? If you're still watching, make sure you hit subscribe, because what I did next didn't just expose my father. It turned the whole city of Toronto on its head. Execution, I learned, is both an art and a slow-burning machine. It isn't one thunderous blow. It's a sequence of small, surgical strikes that look accidental until the pattern is impossible to ignore. So I set the machine in motion. First step, corroboration. Documents can be dismissed as mistakes. Screenshots can be dismissed as edits. But patterns are stubborn. I gave the journalist the first packet. Clean, time-stamped, cross-referenced files showing transfers, shell company names, and the charity fronts my father used to launder money. I didn't pour everything at once. I fed the story carefully, a drip that built curiosity, credibility, and pressure. Second, witnesses. People are messy, and truth comes with messy human noise. There were contractors who'd been paid late, a retired accountant who'd noticed odd ledger entries, an ex-employee who kept a folder in the back of a drawer, just in case. I found them quietly, over coffee or in dimly lit lobbies, and I listened. I recorded accounts, took dates, cross-checked invoices. They had been ignored for years. Now their memories were proof. When combined with the files, their testimony became a rope that could pull down a well-built lie. Third, infiltration. Working under a freelance alias at one of my father's partner agencies was risky, but invaluable. I touched the edges of their communication. I edited press releases that would later be dissected for inconsistencies. I gently nudged phrasing so that certain phrases appeared publicly and could be searched. Little breadcrumb words that, when collected, pointed to the same pattern I had been saving in secret. It was theater, but theater that forced scrutiny. Fourth, timing. The journalist released the first piece just after the company announced a glossy charity gala. The timing was intentional. The contrast between the sparkling PR and the dark ledger items created cognitive dissonance for anyone reading. People began to talk. Donors asked questions. One small trustee resigned quietly. A bank put a temporary hold on a transfer. The cracks widened. Fifth, legal leverage. I passed a notarized packet to my lawyer, the one who never flinched and never asked for applause. He filed an anonymous tip with the regulatory body and prepared civil documents should they be needed. I didn't want a courtroom spectacle. I wanted the kind of legal pressure that made men sleep in suits and check their phones at 3 a.m. The kind of pressure that makes people call lawyers instead of daughters. Every move I made was measured. No public rants. No viral calls. No melodrama. Just a careful assembly of facts, timestamps, witnesses, and timing. The world responded the way it always does. Slowly, then all at once. The second article dropped. It named shell companies and traced charitable donations that never reached the supposed causes. A trustee went on record. A small investor asked the stockholder committee for explanations. My father was asked questions he hadn't rehearsed for on camera. His calm began to rattle. Then the leaks started to behave like a tide. Internal emails I'd left suggestively phrased in my freelance role were pulled into the narrative. Board members who once stood by him shifted in private meetings. One by one, his allies became embarrassed by association. The media scent intensified. My phone filled with messages. Not from him or my mother, but from people I barely knew. Former colleagues, frightened suppliers, a woman who'd once been a secretary and now offered to come forward in a deposition. The net tightened. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I'd gone too far. If my hunger for justice had become cruelty. But then I'd remember the faces of the people lost in that blast. Their desks frozen in time, laptops closed forever, lunches eaten by the company that would no longer need to pay them. Justice, in my mind, had a moral geometry to it. I was merely realigning the balance. And then came the day everything changed. A regulatory raid. Quiet officers with papers at dawn. 2 trustees escorted from their offices. My father taken in for questioning. Not dramatized, not cinematic, practical, efficient, and final. He sat across from an investigator, all the power drained from his face. I watched the live news stream with a calm so cold it surprised me. But truth has its own consequences. The city turned toward my story like a compass needle to steel. Investors panicked. The company's stock dipped. Contracts were suspended. My father's name, once brandished in glossy profiles, began to appear in headlines with quiet, accusing verbs. Under investigation. Alleged transfers. Review initiated. I didn't celebrate. I lit no candles. Instead, I documented. Every article, every complaint, every new filing was another piece of the mosaic. I kept the backups, the witnesses' signed notes, and the cloud copies in 3 safe countries. I ensured that this time, the truth could not be bought back into silence. And then, like a slow exhale, the calls started coming. From cousins, from acquaintances, from my mother. I let them ring. I let them confess. I let them panic. They had wanted silence for so long that the sound of my quiet work must have felt like a betrayal of their preferred peace. When my mother finally spoke, her voice was raw. She asked questions not seeking excuses but looking for a map back to some version of love. I listened. I answered not with vindictiveness but with facts. Because facts, when deployed slowly and precisely, are the kind of revenge that leaves no room for theater, only consequence. Before I carry on, and there are still small moments to tell, small victories followed by the heavier reckonings that followed after. Tell me this. Would you build a quiet case and watch the fall, or call it out and watch the ashes fly? Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments. Team patient justice or team instant rage? Because what came next was the hardest part. Living with the change, with the knowledge that one life's collapse can give another life breathing room. And that breathing room asks for something called forgiveness. Or at least the peace that comes after everything burns down and you're left standing in the quiet. When the dust finally settled, Toronto felt different. It wasn't louder or calmer, just emptier. The kind of silence that only follows destruction. My father's empire had crumbled. The press called it the Carter collapse. Reporters swarmed our old neighborhood like moths around an open flame. And every interview was another nail in the coffin of the man who once controlled half the construction contracts in the city. And me. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a ghost, haunting the ruins of my own creation. The morning after the raid, I sat by the window of my small apartment downtown. Rain streaked down the glass like veins, the city still waking up. Across from me, my laptop screen blinked with new messages. Journalists, victims, lawyers, even strangers thanking me for what I'd done. But beneath the praise, there was a deep ache, a hollowness that victory doesn't cure. Because revenge, even when justified, doesn't restore what was lost. It only levels the field. And the cost of leveling it is you. 2 weeks later, I visited my old house, the Carter estate, now sealed off by authorities. The grand oak doors were boarded up, the gardens overgrown. It was strange seeing it like that. The home where I'd once hosted laughter and dinners, now a symbol of deceit and pride. As I stood there, I saw my mother. She wasn't angry. She wasn't crying either. She just looked tired, as if life had finally caught up to her. She approached me slowly, the heels of her shoes crunching against gravel. "You destroyed him, Elena," she said softly. "Your own father." Her voice trembled, but her eyes said something else. Relief. Maybe even admiration she couldn't admit out loud. "He destroyed himself, Mom," I whispered. "I just stopped pretending he didn't." She nodded once, then turned away. And that was the last time I saw her. Days turned into weeks. The media frenzy died down, the lawsuits settled, and people moved on to the next scandal. But I couldn't. Because in revenge there's no finish line, only echoes. Every night, I still replayed that morning in my head. The moment my neighbor Marcus had knocked on my door at 5 a.m. and whispered those words that changed everything. "Don't go to work today. Just trust me." If he hadn't said that, I'd have died in that explosion. And maybe this entire story, this entire war would have died with me. One evening Marcus came by again. Same quiet knock, same hesitation in his eyes. He'd been the one who uncovered the anonymous tip months before. The one who first hinted that my father's accident might not have been so accidental. I never asked how he knew. I just knew he was the reason I survived. And maybe the reason I found the strength to uncover everything else. "You did what most people wouldn't dare," he said. "But what now, Elena? You've exposed him. You've won. What's left?" I stared out at the skyline. The same skyline my father had once owned piece by piece, and said, "Now I rebuild." But this time without ghosts. In the months that followed, I launched something small, a non-profit fund to support whistleblowers and victims of corporate cover-ups. I named it the Gray Foundation, after the color of truth. Not black or white, just the complicated in-between where most of life happens. For the first time in years, I wasn't haunted by revenge. I was driven by purpose. Still sometimes I'd drive by the old estate, not to gloat but to remind myself that justice isn't about winning, it's about ending. And in that ending there's peace. But if you've followed my story this far, you already know. Peace never lasts forever. Because one night months later I received a package. No return address. No name. Just a USB drive. Inside, a single video file. It showed a recording from 2 years ago. Security footage from the morning of the explosion. And what I saw, it wasn't my father. It wasn't any of his men. It was Marcus, my neighbor, walking into the building, minutes before it went up in flames. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to know, would you open that file again, if it meant uncovering a deeper betrayal? Or would you finally let the past rest? Tell me what you'd do in the comments, and don't forget, hit that subscribe button if you're ready for the final chapter. Because this is where the real story begins. When I first saw that footage, froze. No heartbeat, no thoughts. Just a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The video was grainy, time-stamped the morning of the explosion. And there he was, Marcus, my neighbor, my friend, the man who knocked on my door at 5 a.m. and told me not to go to work, the man who saved my life. But in that footage, Marcus wasn't outside warning anyone. He was walking into the building minutes before it blew up. I replayed it over and over, hoping I was wrong. Maybe it was someone who looked like him. Maybe it was edited. But every time I paused the frame, I saw that same brown leather jacket, that same uneven stride, the same nervous twitch of his hand. It was him. No doubt. And suddenly everything, every word he'd said, every look, every comforting smile, became a question I didn't want to answer. I didn't sleep that night. Toronto was drowning in winter rain, and I sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark window, wondering if I'd been a fool twice in one lifetime. First my father. Now Marcus. Maybe I wasn't a survivor at all. Maybe I was just a magnet for betrayal. By morning I needed answers. I wasn't going to sit there and let my mind eat itself alive. So I did what I do best, I investigated. And what I found was worse than the lie itself. Marcus wasn't just my neighbor. He was a former investigator for one of my father's rival companies, fired 6 years ago for whistleblowing misconduct. That meant he wasn't some random man who happened to live next door. He had a reason to be there. History. A grudge. The next day I drove to his building, Unit 12B, 3rd floor. He opened the door like he'd been expecting me. "Hey Elena," he said, voice calm, almost rehearsed. Like he'd practiced this moment in his head 1,000 times. I held up the USB drive. "You want to explain why you were inside my office building the morning it exploded?" He didn't even flinch. Aside. Then stepped aside. "You should come in." Inside, his place was bare. No pictures, no warmth, just a man living halfway between guilt and obsession. He sat, poured coffee, and said, "I didn't plant that bomb, Elena." "Then why were you there?" He hesitated. "I knew what was coming. I tried to stop it. But when I realized I couldn't, I made sure you wouldn't be there." His words hit me like a knife. "You knew," I whispered. "You knew my father's building was going to explode, and you let it happen?" He looked up slowly. "You don't understand. That explosion was never meant for you. It was meant for him. Your father. He was supposed to be there that day." I laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that brings relief. It was the sound of disbelief cracking into rage. So what was I? Collateral damage. A pawn. Did you use me to finish what you couldn't? He stared at me for a long moment. then said, "We both lost something because of him. I lost my career. You lost your innocence. I didn't use you, Elena. I just didn't stop you." That's when it hit me. Marcus didn't see himself as my betrayer. He saw himself as my ally in revenge. The worst kind of ally, the kind who lets you destroy yourself and calls it justice. I walked out without another word. The snow was falling harder, the world turning white, quiet, unforgiving. And as I stood outside his door, I realized I wasn't done yet. Because Marcus had one thing my father never did: my trust. And that made his betrayal far more personal. So I did what I had to. 2 weeks later, the world knew Marcus Walker's name. Not as a hero, not as a victim, but as a man who manipulated a grieving daughter into dismantling her father's empire for his personal vendetta. The evidence came from an anonymous source. His employers reopened his old case. Investigations began. Contracts collapsed. He wasn't arrested, but he might as well have been, because in Toronto, reputation is currency. And I just emptied his account. Did it make me feel better? Not exactly. But it made things right. Because revenge isn't about peace. It's about balance. And for once, the scales finally felt even. Before I close this part, I want to ask you something. Would you have done the same? Would you have exposed Marcus, or walked away, knowing he once saved your life? Tell me what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe because the next story will remind you. Some debts can only be repaid in silence. They say revenge is a storm, fierce, loud, and unforgiving. But what they never tell you is what comes after the storm. The silence, the emptiness, the way the world looks the same but you're no longer part of it. That's what I felt months later, standing by the edge of Lake Ontario. The city skyline shimmered against the water. Familiar yet foreign. Toronto had moved on. People had moved on. And me. I was still trying to remember who I was before everything burned. After Marcus's fall, there was no satisfaction, no celebration. Just the faint echo of justice, fading like a song long after the music stopped. The news painted me as a heroine. The whistleblower's whistleblower, they called me. But truth be told, I wasn't a hero. I was just a woman who'd finally stopped being afraid. And in that courage, I found something even rarer than revenge. Found peace. I started rebuilding. Not the empire my father left behind, but something smaller. Something real. I kept the gray foundation alive, helping others who had been silenced, deceived, or broken by people they trusted. Each case was another piece of redemption. Not for them but for me. I learned that closure isn't a door you slam shut. It's a window you open slowly, letting light back in, one ray at a time. One afternoon months later I received a letter. No name, no return address. Just a simple note on plain paper. "You were right to do what you did. I would have done the same. Marcus." I read it once. Then again. There was no anger left. No bitterness. Just a strange calm. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't begged for forgiveness either. It was his way of saying goodbye. I folded the letter, placed it in a box with the USB drive, and tucked it away. Because some stories don't need endings. They just need silence. Now, when I walk through the city, I see faces that remind me of the past. Fathers protecting secrets, daughters carrying burdens, neighbors with eyes that know too much. But I don't run anymore. I don't chase closure. I live. Because the greatest revenge isn't exposing others. It's rebuilding yourself after they've tried to destroy you. So if you're listening right now, wherever you are, remember this. They might take your trust. They might break your heart. But they can never define your ending. Only you can. And as for me, I'm no longer the woman who waited for the storm to pass. I became the calm after it. Me. What would you have done in my place? Would you have forgiven Marcus? Or written his name in fire the way I did? Let me know in the comments, and please don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you believe in strength after betrayal, because my next story will prove that sometimes survival is the sweetest revenge.